You hear them before you see them, the chains. Not the kind that bind ankles or wrists, but something far more insidious, the invisible kind that wraps around bloodlines, that calculates the worth of a heartbeat before it even begins. You're standing in a place where human beings were bred like livestock, where children were investments, and where the most intimate act of creation became a transaction written in ledgers and sold at auction blocks. This is not a story about the past staying in the past. This is about DNA that still remembers. Before we dive deeper into this darkness, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching this from? It's genuinely mind-blowing that a story this painful, this hidden, connects with people across every continent. The year is 1808. The United States has just abolished the international slave trade. Congress, in what many celebrated as a moral victory, made it illegal to import enslaved Africans into American soil. Champagne was poured in certain circles. Sermons were preached about progress, but in the tobacco fields of Virginia, the cotton plantations of South Carolina, and the sugar estates of Louisiana, a different calculation was being made. If the supply of enslaved people could no longer flow from across the Atlantic, then the commodity would have to reproduce itself. And so, with the cold logic of economics and the grotesque creativity of absolute power, American slaveholders engineered a system that would treat human reproduction as agricultural yield. They called them breeding farms, though the term rarely appeared in polite company. In ledgers, they used softer language, natural increase, stock prospects. But the enslaved knew exactly what it was. They lived it in their bodies. The practice didn't emerge overnight. It evolved, methodically, as slavery itself transformed from a labor system into something far more calculative, a hereditary caste sustained by biological control. In the decades following 1808, the domestic slave trade exploded. The Upper South, particularly Virginia and Maryland, became what historians would later describe as breeding grounds. Enslaved populations in these states grew not primarily through birth rates common to free populations, but through deliberate, forced reproduction designed to supply the labor-hungry cotton boom of the Deep South. By the 1830s, Virginia was exporting approximately 6,000 enslaved people annually to southern markets. This wasn't accidental population growth. This was production. What did this look like on the ground, in the suffocating heat of a summer night, when privacy was a fantasy and bodily autonomy was a concept reserved for others? It looked like Louisa Pictet, who later testified that she was sold away from her mother at age 13, specifically because her light skin, the result of her enslaver's rape of her mother, made her valuable for a different kind of exploitation. It looked like Rose, an enslaved woman in South Carolina who was given to another plantation's enslaved man for visiting privileges every few months. Her enslaver, tracking her menstrual cycles in a small notebook kept in his desk, it looked like Willis man remembered in oral histories as being forced to father children with multiple women across 3 different plantations. His own grief and rage at being used as breeding stock never recorded in any master's diary, only whispered through generations. But here's where the horror deepens, where the system reveals its most calculated cruelty. It wasn't enough to simply encourage reproduction through proximity. Enslavers studied it. They theorized about it. They wrote agricultural journals debating the methods. In Southern Cultivator and other plantation management publications, essays appeared with titles like Management of Negroes that discussed breeding with the same clinical detachment as articles on cotton yields and livestock fertility. Some enslavers offered incentives, small plots of land, extra rations, or reduced workloads to women who bore many children. Others used violence, selling away children to coerce compliance, or punishing women whose bodies didn't produce according to expectation. The most chilling documents are the breeding records themselves. Ledgers that tracked not just names, but bloodlines, that noted which pairings produced strong offspring, which women were good breeders, which men passed on desirable traits. Dr. Josiah Nott, a physician in Mobile, Alabama, published theories about racial biology that slaveholders consumed eagerly. He argued that enslaved people were a separate species, best suited for labor, and that selective reproduction could enhance their value. Though his science was grotesque pseudoscience, it gave intellectual cover to practices already underway. Thomas Jefferson himself, at Monticello, kept meticulous records of births among the enslaved population, noting in letters that a woman who brings a child every 2 years is more profitable than the best man on the farm. He wasn't speaking philosophically. He was calculating assets. The same man who wrote All Men Are Created Equal treated human reproduction as a revenue stream, and fathered children with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who had no legal right to refuse him. The domestic slave trade that flourished between 1808 and 1865 ripped apart approximately 1 million families. 1 million husbands, torn from wives, mothers from children, but the breeding farms added another dimension of trauma. Children born in Virginia were raised knowing they'd likely be sold south. Mothers nursed infants aware that each bond they formed was provisional, subject to market forces. The psychological architecture of this system was designed to prevent the formation of stable kinship, while simultaneously demanding reproduction. It was a human factory that required the raw material of love and attachment to function, then systematically destroyed those very bonds for profit. Consider the testimony of Henry Bibb, who escaped slavery and wrote his narrative in 1849. He described being sold away from his wife and daughter. But what haunts his account is the moment before when his enslaver told him he was too attached to his family, that such feelings made him less valuable because they might inspire escape. Yet that same enslaver had encouraged Bibb to marry, had even performed the ceremony, because married enslaved men were believed to be more stable, less likely to rebel. The contradiction was the point. The system demanded humanity the capacity to bond, to love, to create, while simultaneously punishing it. It needed enslaved people to be human enough to reproduce and parent, but not human enough to claim rights over their own children. The architecture of breeding farms often reflected their purpose. Certain plantations in Virginia's Piedmont region constructed cabins deliberately small with thin walls, arranged in rows that maximized surveillance. Privacy was structurally impossible. Enslavers and overseers walked the quarters at night, monitoring who slept where, enforcing pairings, interrupting relationships that didn't serve economic interests. Some historians have documented breeding cabins on certain estates' structures where enslaved people were ordered to spend nights together, their compliance enforced through the ever-present threat of violence or sale. But here's what the ledgers couldn't capture, what the slaveholders' meticulous records failed to account for: resistance. Enslaved women used folk medicine to induce miscarriages. They nursed each other's children when mothers were sold away, creating kinship networks that defied the paper genealogies kept in plantation offices. They named their children after lost relatives, keeping memory alive through generations. They taught them to read when literacy was criminalized, knowing that knowledge was the one inheritance that couldn't be sold at auction. In narratives collected by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s, formerly enslaved people recalled their mothers and grandmothers speaking of taking the trade, a euphemism for abortion or infanticide acts of devastating agency in a system designed to deny all agency. These weren't choices anyone should ever have to make. They were refusals to let their children become commodities, acts of resistance carved into their own bodies. The genetic legacy is not metaphorical. Modern DNA studies have revealed the biological footprints of slavery's sexual violence and forced reproduction. African Americans today carry genetic markers showing disproportionate European ancestry on paternal lines, evidence of rape by white enslavers passed down through generations. Research published in the American Journal of Human Genetics has traced how these patterns of admixture cluster geographically, highest in the Upper South where breeding farms were concentrated. The bodies of descendants literally carry the history, written in nucleotides, a molecular memory of who was forced to reproduce with whom. By the 1850s, the economic value of enslaved people in the United States exceeded the combined value of all railroads and factories in the nation. The majority of that wealth wasn't generated through labor alone, but through this biological increase, this human crop that renewed itself. When enslavers purchased life insurance policies on the enslaved, yes, that happened, they often insured women of childbearing age at higher premiums, explicitly factoring in their reproductive potential. When banks accepted enslaved people as collateral for loans, pregnancy increased the assessed value. The entire financial infrastructure of the antebellum South was built on the expectation that enslaved bodies would produce more enslaved bodies. And then the Civil War came. Emancipation arrived, not as a gift, but as a hard-won liberation paid for in blood. When the enslaved walked off plantations, many were searching for family, husbands for wives, parents for children, siblings separated decades before. Newspapers in the Reconstruction era filled with ads, information wanted of Carolyn Davis, who was sold from Nashville in 1848. Searching for my mother, Eliza, last seen in Richmond. The breeding farms had scattered bloodlines across 1,000 miles, and now people tried to gather the pieces. Most never found who they were looking for. The genetic nightmare didn't end with slavery's legal abolition. Its consequences rippled forward. In archives across the South, if you know where to look, you can still find them, the breeding records, preserved in fading ink. The University of Virginia holds the Massey family papers, which include a Negro book tracking births with the same notation style as livestock registries. The Library of Congress houses Plantation, journals where enslavers recorded which women had failed to increase and speculated about causes. These documents are difficult to read, not because the handwriting is unclear, but because they force confrontation with the bureaucratic mundanity of atrocity. Evil wasn't always theatrical. Sometimes it was a planter at a desk, dipping a pen in ink, writing a child's name in a column marked assets. The psychological aftermath persisted for generations. Scholars studying post-traumatic slave syndrome have noted patterns of family disruption, mistrust of institutions, and adaptive survival strategies that trace directly back to the breeding era. When your great-great-grandmother was bred like livestock, when family meant something that could be bought and sold, the trauma doesn't vanish with legal freedom. It embeds itself in how communities form, how intimacy is navigated, how vulnerability is risked. The erasure of African naming practices, the severing of genealogical knowledge, the deliberate destruction of kinship records, these were tools of the breeding system, and their effects linger. What makes this history especially painful is how thoroughly it was hidden. After emancipation, many white Southerners sanitized slavery's memory, constructing myths of paternalism and mutual affection. The breeding farms disappeared from popular narratives, relegated to whispers and scholarly footnotes. Even some abolitionists, while condemning slavery, shied away from discussing the sexual violence and forced reproduction at its core, finding it too indelicate for public discourse. The victims themselves often carried the stories in silence. The shame weaponized by oppressors, now internalized, passed down as unspoken knowledge. Only in recent decades have historians, genealogists, and descendants begun systematically unearthing this buried truth, forcing the nation to look at what it preferred to forget. One artifact haunts me more than most. It's a letter, held now at the Smithsonian, written in 1863 by a woman named Annie Davis in Missouri to President Lincoln. She'd heard rumors of emancipation, but didn't know if they applied to her state. Her letter is brief, her handwriting careful, learned in secret. She asks if she's free. She asks if she can leave, but midway through, she mentions her children, 3 of them, and asks if they're free too, or if they still belong to her enslaver. The question reveals everything. She doesn't know if her own children are hers. The breeding system made parenthood provisional, a relationship subject to ownership laws. When freedom came, it had to be relearned what it meant to be a mother with rights, a father with authority, a family that couldn't be dissolved by a bill of sale. The breeding farms were not an aberration. They were the logical extension of a system that defined people as property. They reveal slavery's core truth that it wasn't just labor extraction but biological dominion, a claim over future generations, an attempt to own not just bodies but bloodlines. The genetic nightmare wasn't accidental, it was policy. And here we are now, generations later, still tracing the lines. DNA tests reveal connections across continents, genetic cousins who share ancestors torn apart by sale. Descendants organize reunions, rebuilding family trees from fragments. The human instinct to connect, to know where we come from, refuses to be extinguished. The same resilience that survived the breeding farms now fuels the search for truth. There's a cemetery in Virginia, unmarked graves beneath a canopy of old oaks, no headstones, no names, just depressions in the earth where bodies were laid to rest. Archaeologists believe it's a burial ground for enslaved people from a nearby plantation known in estate records as a breeding farm. The trees have grown tall since then, roots intertwining underground, holding the soil together. The forest doesn't forget, even when monuments refuse to remember. And somewhere in that quiet place, beneath the roots and the silence, is the truth we're still learning to speak, that they were here, that they endured, that their children carry them forward, written not in ledgers but in breath and bone and stubborn, unbreakable life.